So may I start with you, Judy, as a face that I need, as I recognise. Judy, you've really been the key scientist in the Whitmore-Peterson Institute, really. So you're driving the big scientific ideas. What do you think is going to be important in the science, but also what's going to be translated into patient care and diagnostics and things like that?
Well, I think the importance in the science is the approach we're taking, which you'll hear about tomorrow. It's a systems biology approach where we're looking at cohorts of patients that are more well-defined. So they're more homogeneous, if you will, than the heterogeneous. They have the same immunological defects, the same presentation, the infectious, acute, whatever presentation. Dr. Peterson really biases them in that's the cohort he's comfortable with, and he does the best work in diagnosing. So we look at various immunological things to start with and then gather that cohort and then do across-the-board sampling and really state-of-the-art profiling with all mammalian viruses, all immune, 30 immune parameters, genetic HLA and KIR. You'll hear a little bit about that. We've known about NK dysfunction for 20 years in the disease, and now we think we're getting some ideas about susceptibility maybe, and susceptibility in families based on the HLA class 1 interaction. So I think it's the approach where we can translate all of that diagnostically, because then we make smaller chips that are significant to maybe 4 or 5 markers that you can then subgroup on both in the viruses and the immune profiling. And of course, then we understand susceptibility loci and things like that. So
subgroups are going to be fairly important in the way which the Institute is looking at patients. Because this was a big issue last year in the conference. We talked about subgroups. And some people are still buying into the idea that we can lump everybody together. And that's the best we can do, really. There seems to be very little attempt to discriminate in the official attitudes towards ME, where everybody's just put together in a big bag and can be all sorts of anything. So what have you mentioned in your talk, chemokines and cytokines. Can you say a little bit more about those as markers?
Well, what we've done is we've developed I was asked to give the sickest of the sick. So these are the really sick people who have been sick a long time. And when we take those people and we take, I think, 115 of them and 150 normal controls, and we run this profile, we got a 5 cytokine and chemokine signature. And the chemokines will show are really important in other neurodegenerative diseases. The chemokines are trafficking molecules. They take the immune cells and other things to the brain. More importantly, we're learning that they have receptors and binding proteins on neurons themselves and a function in the brain that's distinct from the immune system. So these chemokines in that signature are important. And then the IL-8 signifies the virus we're looking at. And that means that the patients you'll see are really overloaded with some families of viruses expressing a lot. And the families make sense when you know that, for instance, CMV is one of the viruses that's highly expressed in this group at this time, and CMV and IL-8 are sort of in a loop together. One turns the other on, and they make more of each other, and RNA cell turns on expression of RNAs, IL-8. So then you see these things work together, and the biology tends to make sense with what you're seeing in the patient. So I think that the approach will show you that we could do other things with other groups if there were other underlying factors and causes.
One of the questions about detection of viruses particularly, and other infections really, is chicken and egg. The chicken and egg argument is one causative or consequential upon some other initiative, triggering process. What's your take on this? Do you see the viruses as being the key to the precipitation of the illness?
Well, yeah, I'm a virologist, so I came there looking on viral immunopathogenesis. Right. So if you want to call it that, I always look at what happens to the immune system in the context of a viral infection. So while it's certainly not possible to satisfy Koch's postulates because these patients have been sick 20 years. I think what you can say, and we have the ability in the Institute because of Dan's repository that goes back to the initial days, that we could go back, and if we did find one or a few viruses that had not been identified before, I think we could then maybe satisfy Cook's postulates if we found it in the earliest samples at the initiation of the disease. But with the chronically ill, it's difficult to say. I think you look for more treatment targets that are novel.
And what do you think will come out of it in terms of treatment? What do you think might come out of these identification of the viruses?
Well, I think the sky's the limit. I think we can really get some marvelous treatment options if we can identify truly associated, if not causative, things that could be underlying, triggering the immune dysfunction that we see in our patients. That's obviously what we're all out there for, is to find that one or a few things that we could target.
Will these be typical antiviral drugs? I mean, the big antivirals are the ones that are targeted against the herpes family, really, aren't they? The things that have already been in the news with Montoya and Dr. Lerner. And John Cheer is speaking at this conference. He's going to talk about pleconazole, which is an RNA virus inhibitor or antagonist, whatever you want to call it. Do you see new molecules emerging?
Oh, absolutely. I think some broad-spectrum antivirals are really in order, something that's just not targeting. Also to look at having the immune response, so having sort of multi-targeted drugs target the immune system, because if the immune system can get the virus under control, then you can reestablish a homeostasis, is the idea. So I do multi-targeted approaches to.
Well, that's very interesting, because one of the philosophers of philosophical aspects of Ayurvedic medicine in India is there's no such thing as an infectious disease. What you've got to do is strengthen the immune system. And they do have quite a few interesting plants, particularly, that are effective in doing this. So you might very well be. Will you be delving into those aspects of medicine, the sort of the traditional medicines of India and China, particularly, which are well developed and well structured to get plants out of it? But
absolutely, the Institute actually has an industrial collaborator, Genius Biomed, and they're in California, and they make anti-natural product, multi-target and multifunctional, and I'm their vice president of research, so I'm targeting towards, they target cancer, and I'm targeting it more towards the CNS diseases since I've been at the Institute. So
it's all very encouraging, and it all seems to fit with what could call the traditional old-fashioned view of ME as an inflammatory illness affecting the brain and the spinal cord. So it's a neurological illness which is not consistent with the attempts to make it of psychogenic origin and therefore avoid all these complicated science and medicine that's necessary to engage with the illness and treat patients effectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good,
yeah.
Right. Well, that's encouraging, and we look forward to your talk, and I'm sure it'll be as inspiring and challenging as it was last time. Thanks very much, Judy. Right, now then, this is Hilary Johnson. Now, this is a big name. Everybody knows Hilary's name. So take a good look at this lady.
Really.
She's done some great work. And so when you first wrote the book, the first edition, can we call it the first edition, or is it?
The first edition, yes,
first
1996.
Edition, right. That seems to me to have put the whole story on the map in a way that made it undeniable, really. So tell me how you came to write it, first of all, because I think patients will say, how she's written all about us, how did she come to get involved in this?
Well, let's see, I was a journalist. I had been a journalist for about 15 years. And in March of 1986, fell ill with this disease and was sort of, out of commission for about a year and had many queries from magazine editors saying, hey, what's up? How come you're not doing any work? And finally, I spoke to my editor at Rolling Stone magazine, where I was a contributing editor, who said, look, why don't you write about what's going on? Why don't you write about this disease? And I had just finished reading an article that day in the Los Angeles Times about an outbreak of a very strange illness in Incline Village, Nevada. And as I read the symptoms and everything, and the discussion of the doctors who were struggling to figure out what this was, and it talked about how the Centers for Disease Control had already been to Incline Village to investigate. And, I sort of had my journalist hat on, and I thought, wow, this isn't just me with this strange, peculiar problem. This is, this sounds like it might be a story. So I went to Incline Village and also went to Washington, interviewed Stephen Strauss at the NIH and so on, and wrote a piece for Rolling Stone magazine that was quite lengthy, which then evolved into the book itself. I mean, several publishers approached me and said, would you like to write a book about this? And I remember thinking, well, it's a very depressing topic. If I could do this book in 18 months, then I think it might be worthwhile. Right. And then 9 years later, I finished the book. Right. And it was quite a nightmare. It was, Groundhog Day every day for 9 years. But one reason it took so long is that I got very involved in the day-to-day goings-on in this disease, and there were developments daily, it seemed. And, the book really had to, the end of the story just never came. It just kept getting more complicated and more internecine and more political and more dramatic. And people kept saying, when are you going to finish that book, Hillary? And I'd say, well, soon. I kept looking for resolution. Of course, It never came, but I ultimately did bring the book to an end. I can't remember if there was any one thing that made me say, okay, this is it now. This is the story. Yeah. But
the astonishing thing about what you've been saying is that people with ME are supposed to have no energy and often have brain fog, and the brain sort of switches off. And yet you've managed to sustain a huge amount of energy and effort over 9 years, and also to tell the story meticulously, really. I think the thing that impressed me about the first edition was that the story was set out in very precise detail, and so it was almost a reference text for an epidemiologist looking to say, where's the next thing that happens.
It is like an Encyclopedia Britannica of ME now, it really is. Yeah. But, actually... I was extremely ill during those years. And there were times when I would get to an interview, turn on my tape recorder, and I would have my list of questions, and I would ask the questions. I always came as well prepared as possible. I'd ask the questions. When I would hear no more sound, when the voice ended, I'd realize it was time to ask the next question. I wasn't functioning as well as I normally would have been had I been well, because I couldn't really even understand what people were saying sometimes. And they weren't even necessarily talking about science. It was just, there was silence. I knew it was time to ask the next question. And it was only when I got home and had slept for 10 days and could get up and listen to the tape and start really understanding what had been said, and then go back and do follow-up questions if necessary on the phone and such. I mean, there were many, many techniques I had to develop as a result of this illness that I had never dreamt would be required as a journalist. And, this is a book that probably would have been done in 18 months or 2 years had I not been ill. It would have been a very different book, obviously. Yeah. But it certainly, in the 9 years that I spent doing this book, I probably could have written 3 other books. Yeah. So it was very, very much of my illness did have a tremendous impact.
Right. Well, I have a list at home where I've put up VCs in the ME world, and I award these to people who I think have been well beyond the call of duty and being courageous beyond belief. One of them is Vance Spence, who we all know, but another one is now Hillary Johnson, because I hadn't realised that he'd been so ill. One of the things that Vance did when he looked at ME patients was he found much to the chagrin and dismay of the psychogenic origin guys, that people who've got ME, many of them have got very good mental health scores. So they're functioning quite well mentally, even if they know it's just when the sound stops to ask the next question.
Right, exactly.
But so, I mean, you've given the lie to the fact that people with ME can't do things, even when they're tired and really, well, knackered is a word that we'd use in England. We're now allowed to use that word. It used to be very rude when I was a child, but I'm a bit older now. So it seems to me that what you've done is really a very great service to the ME community, and you've written it out of the illness itself. So it's not something that's been written and then you've been ill, or you've been ill and then you've got better. It's the fact that you've been wrestling with the illness at the same time you've been wrestling with the writing. And I'm sure that will have enriched the book.
I think that having this illness, I had an enormous stake in the outcome, which is, there is no outcome yet, and I still feel I have an enormous stake in the outcome. But it was a tremendous motivator. It became an obsession. I don't think, there's no question that I would have persisted or put that much time into any topic had I not had this illness. It was... I really, really care what happens in this disease. So
well, we're very glad you did, because that's terrific. Now, you're doing a second edition now.
You said I'm eager for the second one, and I thought, oh dear, because I've not written I wrote a second book, but it was a memoir of my mother.
Right.
But I have updated the old edition and brought out a new edition. And so that's what's available now.
What did you feel was important to make you go through all this hard work again to update the first book?
Well, the first edition was out of print.
Right.
And I felt that it still should have I felt that the book still probably had an audience. I mean, really, when there's a whole new generation now of people who have this disease. It's been 25 years. Right. I'm constantly hearing about and seeing on the internet discussions among people who've really just had the disease for a year or two or three. And there's so much that, they seem... there's a certain naivete, shall we say, among these patients. They don't really have a sense of the history of what happened. And I feel that the book probably might be helpful to these people who are newly diagnosed. So I felt to make it, more attractive, that I would add an epilogue and sort of bring it up to date. So I did that, and that was completed a couple of years ago.
Do you think there's more grounds for hope now than there was when you wrote the first book?
That's a complicated question, because, there's the Whittemore Peterson Institute. Obviously, it's like a great beacon in a world of dark fog, because I think that the federal. I can only speak really with any confidence about the federal response in the United States at the NIH and the Centers for Disease Control. And I think that what began as just kind of a Keystone Cops, cover your derriere kind of response to this disease in 1985-86, when there was an outbreak in Nevada, that has basically turned into an institutional. It's become institutionalized. It's become. It's like it's part of the institutional DNA at the CDC now to break this disease into little categories of fatigue, and to have medicalized the symptom of fatigue. And I don't need to go into all the details about what the CDC has done to the original concept of this disease, but it's essentially erased it and it's just wreaked havoc around the world in terms of confusing what is what. And when I wrote Osler's Web in when I started meeting these people in 1986, 87, it was just individual people. You could actually point to people, or you could name people who were responsible for these kinds of problems. Now, it's not about individuals at these agencies anymore. This is what I mean when I say these theories and misperceptions have become institutional, and I think it's, in that way, it's less hopeful. It's more, one can only look to science for salvation, obviously. These agencies are not performing science. It's almost like a form of marketing that they're engaged in.
May I add?
Please.
Because she's so right. Without Annette Whittemore, so two members, somebody that were past CDC, sat on the CFS review committee and took Jonathan Kerr in our R01 and dissed it 3 times out of funding. And I should say that we've completed every one of those aims of a 5-year study in 2.5. And if Annette hadn't said, "Keep doing it, Judy, I'll pay for it," we wouldn't get to do it.
The CDC, a close friend of mine who's a very skilled editor read my speech that I'm giving tonight, actually, and she said, "Hillary, you need to write another book, and here's the title, Control Freaks, how the CDC has kept Americans sick." And, they are control freaks, and they are very invested in their own authority, even though they have no authority because they're not functioning as scientists. And they have driven a lot of really, really brilliant scientists out of this field. And this is going back to the 1980s and 90s. For instance, Jay Levy, who was co-discoverer of HIV in the United States, a San Francisco scientist who very, very interested in pursuing the pathogen at the heart of this disease. He was persuaded of that. And he must have applied 3 or 4 times to the NIH for money, for grant money to pursue this interest, and was turned down and finally just walked away. And there are several instances of that, of very, very high-powered scientists who were very, very eager and interested to become involved in this disease in the late 80s and early 90s, who were discouraged by the American health establishment by refusal, because the NIH refused to fund them, and the CDC kind of stepped in and took over and took this field over. And one, as patients, I think the best anyone can hope for is that there's some major scientific breakthrough. But even then, I think there's going to be a great struggle. The CDC, I think, is going to put up a tremendous fight.
Well, you're warning us. We have exactly the same problem in this country, so it's great to have it in print, and we'll use all your adjectives we might invent a few of our own as well, because we have exactly the same issue in this country, and I think in Norway until recently they had the same issue as well, where there's a complete refusal of people who are labelled as scientists or doctors, and yet who seem to have departed a long time ago from any active engagement in either medicine or science, and making decisions and forming conclusions which are actually to the very grave disadvantage of patients, and to great loss to those who have got a scientific curiosity or a medical curiosity. Yes. This is a big problem. Why can't we engage with it as a big problem?
It's an extraordinary problem. It's a scandal beyond any scandal I can think of. I mean, millions of people around the globe are sick with this disease. Millions of people, their lives have been utterly destroyed, and not millions, but we know that people are dying of this disease. It's absolutely criminal what's going on, and the big question is why? Why is this happening? And I hope to address that issue of why tonight. But there are a lot of problems. I mean, the media has been, I think, is a big part of the problem, And then, you have to ask who gains from this. Obviously, psychiatrists gain in an enormous way. Disability insurers are gaining. A lot of prestige accrues to these people. You have central governments of nations that don't have to perform research, don't have to spend money. There's almost sort of an ill-defined collusion between these different parties or actors it's just very to prevent public panic. That's also a big piece of this, I think. Nobody wants to stand up and say, talk about what really has happened. That what began as just some cases in the early 80s has turned into a massive epidemic of millions of cases. No one wants to talk about that.
Right. Well, and that leaves patients abandoned, really.
Absolutely.
With very little hope. But you're the hope, along with Judy and Dan, and Barbara, of course. Now, Barbara, you're a new face of the conference, as far as I can remember, but it's great to have you here, because you come in on the success of the tidal wave of patients, really, in Norway, led by Ellen Piro, who many of us know very well, and who spoke at one of our conferences. So you're hoping to, you have established a national centre, am I right in this, for ME?
Well, first I say thanks to the ME Association in Norway and Ellen Piro's work towards politicians. They got much more aware of ME as a disease and a problem in Norway, since 2003, something like that. And in Norway, the press has been very active and has been writing a lot about it. So in Norway now, everybody knows about ME, but we also have the problem. Some people think it's something psychiatric and something you can treat with CBT or things like that. And I meet at our hospital doctors who say, but you have to offer CBT as well. We say, well, anyway, so it's not that easy. It's not like Norway is saved or is kind of. Everybody thinks the same thing, I think there are differences in how Norwegian doctors look at ME as well. But it's a long story how we got started. Anyway, there was a political interest in ME, and then they were looking into research, and they were only looking at they had very strict measures on which kind of studies could be taken into concern. So what came out of that was there seemed to be some somatic pathology, but there seems also to be some psychiatric pathology, and it wasn't what came out of that wasn't very conclusive. But then there came a document in March 2007, I think, that was saying we should establish a center at our hospital, which was then Ullevål University Hospital. Now it's Oslo University Hospital, because now they've joined 3 university hospitals in the Oslo area. Anyway, from 2004-2005, the Eastern Regional Health Authorities of Norway asked Ullevål Hospital by Dr. Brubak, who has been one of 2 doctors in Norway really kind of taking ME seriously since the late 80s. And they knew he was examining patients, and he was also engaged in a coping course for ME patients, and they asked him, couldn't you look at the needs for ME patients and if there's something we could do better, because there's nowhere to go for them. Nobody wants to look at them, they are referred to infectious medicine departments or neurologic departments, and then only get to you're exhausted, you don't find anything. So they didn't get diagnosed very often. And he was the head of the infectious department at Ullevål University Hospital, and he had no time to do that. And then we had a possibility to get GPs work at the hospital 1 day a week to better communication between hospitals and primary health care. So when he had the possibility to engage somebody, he looked for a GP who wanted to work with that. And I have been working with ME patients since 1997, well, I think I might have some before, but I didn't have a clue what was wrong with them. But in 1997, I had a patient who started with vertigo after a series of sinusitis. Autumn 96, she had an acute vertigo. And we thought just it was a virus, and then she wasn't recovering, and she was starting to complain that she was so extremely exhausted by that vertigo. I thought, well, okay, sometimes, but it seemed kind of, it didn't fit, So I sent her to nose, throat specialists. I sent her to neurologists. Nobody found anything. And then she was talking about, even if I just play with my 4-year-old daughter, I get worse. And something back in my head said, haven't I heard about something like post-viral fatigue, And then I was trying to find out. And then she heard about Dr. Brübach, who about that time came to Ulm University Hospital, and she was diagnosed. And then I kind of started to understand a bit. And then I got more and more patients because kind of patients heard, well, I take them seriously. The problem was they always got to hear, well, it's nothing wrong with you, it's just to pull yourself together and then things go better. And things didn't go better, they got worse, because if people do too much, they get worse. So anyway, I started to get lots of ME patients in my general practice. So when I had the possibility to do that work at the hospital and look into this issue 1 day a week, I thought it was perfect. So when I heard about that possibility, I phoned Dr. Brübach, and he knew me because I had referred a lot of patients to him and said, yeah, it's okay, come here, you get the job. So that's how we got started. And then he gave me a lot of papers to read, articles on all the immunologic things going on with ME patients, and I was following the coping course we had at the hospital and learned a lot, and one of our occupational therapists had written an article on ME patients and so on. So I just kind of collect information everywhere. I started working with that in April 2006, and then in November 2006, the director of the hospital was talking to us GPs working at the hospital, and asked what we are doing. And I told her, I'm looking at the possibility to establish an outpatient clinic for ME patients. And she said, well, that's really interesting, and could you give me a plan and a budget in 2 weeks?
Right.
Okay. With one day a week working. So it was it wasn't perfect, but she got something, and she was giving that back to the health authorities. And then we didn't hear anything, and I was going on working on that concept and including an ambulant team, because the real problem are the really ill patients who aren't able to come, or sometimes they came by ambulance, but they wouldn't be able to speak, or they wouldn't hear what you answer. That's also my experience, if you talk to an ME patient for a while, after a while they just fade out, and you see they don't hear a word of what you're saying. And then I found out we need an ambulant team as well. So I made a concept for an outpatient clinic and an ambulant team. And then suddenly, January 2008, we had money. Suddenly we got, so it's done as a project, because the hospital is always asked to use less money every year. So they said we can't do it without fresh money. So in 2008 we got fresh money. And then I was able to start working with that, not full-time, but almost full-time from last summer. And in December we opened an outpatient clinic and started to look at also ambulant team patients. And we have been to a couple with the ambulant team now, because what we experience is that with the resources we have by now, we only can take 30 new patients a month. And we have 75 referrals a month. So we have more than double as much referrals. And now the Eastern and Southern Norway Regional Health Authority are joined. So we cover about half the Norwegian population, which is 2 million people. And The problem is we don't find doctors who want to work with this. I think when I really started understanding what ME could be, like the research you are doing, and you know, I became aware of all the immunological changes going on. The first real big conference I was the one in Fort Lauderdale, and I think I learned a lot of that. And then I was in Reno in March this year. And anyway, I think it's really interesting. There are lots of things we also want to look into in our outpatient clinic. We want to establish a kind of panel of tests we do in a kind of research follow-up. We follow the patients and see who is having which markers. And we also see there are differences, but maybe if we test everybody who is fulfilling the diagnostic criteria, then we see if we find groups, which I think we will, out of what Jonathan Kerr is seeing and other people. Anyway, we hope to get money to do research as well, but now we've kind of been overwhelmed by patients needing just confirmed diagnosis. And what we also offer is we have an interdisciplinary team, which is the one who's working most days, our occupational therapist. And she's the one who's also been working with the coping course since they started working on that from 2003. That course was also initiated by patients. They came to Bruberg and asked, could we have a course for these patients? And she is teaching patients energy economizing, like how could you do things using less energy, and trying to make people aware of you shouldn't be exhausted every evening. You know, if you're not ill, you're not exhausted every night. You're exhausted sometimes if you've done too much. So ME patients have to start to know when to stop. You know, and sometimes we try to tell them don't do more than 70% of what you think you can, but usually many patients think that's very difficult. Anyway, she tries to teach them that, and we have a dietist who's talking about many ME patients have intolerances and also other advice that might help some patients. And then we have a physiotherapist who's talking about also kind of finding a balance between activity and rest and getting good rest, because our experience is many ME patients, when they try to rest, the body and the mind are racing. You can't calm down and you don't get any more energy. So she's learning them relaxation techniques, kind of active relaxation.
So, well, that's one of the things that strikes me as you were talking is what sort of definition, you're using the word ME, which I rejoice in, because that's its old name, introduced by an English chief medical officer, incidentally. No longer does he follow quite the same persuasion. But it seems to me that one of the big issues, and I'm fearful about your 75 being referred every month, is that you're going to get a ragbag of people if you're not careful, if people are using criteria which don't actually define the patient in a way that makes you confident they are, in fact, have got ME. Are you still bound into the Fukuda definition, the CDC definition?
No, we
or have you developed something different?
We use we use partly the Fukuda definitions. Dr. Bruberg used them earlier, but now we always look at the Canadian definition. Right. So we see that they have kind of symptoms from different groups, and I see in many referred that patients who have kind of had many other diseases for many years kind of want to have an ME diagnosis because that maybe might be better. So sometimes it's really hard, and sometimes I just send it back and say, well, I think you should rule out this or that before we have a look at them. And sometimes people have something completely different. I think 2 days ago we discussed a patient where Dr. Bruberg and I agreed on that's not ME, you know, and sometimes we find gluten intolerance. Yeah. Sometimes we find B12 deficiency, which nobody has looked at it, and so on. So it's very varying how good they are diagnosed before, and it's very variable Yeah, some are referred like, well, this is a patient with chronic fatigue and she needs CBT, because people think that's what we are doing. So we get a lot of different things, but we have to look at each patient. We can't just take them. If we know, we know some doctors who we know how they're diagnosed. So if they have been to those doctors, they can go to the interdisciplinary team, because then we know we can trust the diagnosis. But most patients we see first and diagnose.
It's interesting you raise the B12 story, because that's a big story in England, and we have doctors who are not allowed to prescribe B12. But if the patient blood levels are above, I think it's 300 nanograms, I think that's the break-off figure, in England. And so we have bureaucratically controlled medicine. The system, as Hilary was pointing out, the system is obliging medics to go against their own clinical judgment. They're getting the data, they're doing the clinical assessment, and they say this patient would be helped by having B12 injections. And this is usually the best way of giving it, because oral routes are there, but you've got to have different formulations, so it's a more expensive medicine. And they're not allowed to do it.
They're not allowed to do it. They're not paid for doing it, because in Norway we can't give B12 unless there's an anemia or other of established deficiency on the public health system. But we can give it, and the patient pays for the injections themselves. And many ME patients do that.
Yeah. Well, our patients, it's finding doctors who will do that without compromising their position in the National Health Service. So it's a really big issue.
So they're not allowed to do it, even if they don't chart the
they get a black mark. This doctor is a troublemaker. This doctor is not towing the line. This doctor is not behaving himself. And they've had quite stern warnings from the local health authorities, saying if you persist in this, we're going to have to withdraw your license, or we're going to have to put you somewhere else where you can't do it. Now in Japan, the level is 3 times higher before people take action. But it's tying to this anemias that seems to be the problem. But people have got this B12 deficiency without this sort of what you would call the overt classical features of an anemia issues. And so the doctor, his own integrity is being questioned, his own ability is being questioned, and it's being ignored. And so that's a really big issue. But you can still minister to the patient, provided they pay for their medicines, which in a National Health Service is sort of, people have been paying for this all their lives really, so it goes down badly. But people are doing that in England, and we're buying oral, sublingual tablets because they can't get any other way. And we're buying things which, like methyl B12, which is, I think there's lots of questions about methyl B12 in terms of its stability, in terms of whether that's what you're getting when you actually get the medicine, in terms of the real issues around storage, which can to break down the medicine. So that's one thing. The other thing is, are you getting gluten intolerance without celiacs?
Well,
or does every doctor in England, when you say you've got a gluten intolerance, it's celiacs? And we'll do the antibody test.
People can get money from the official health care system for more expensive food if they have celiac. And sometimes we find that too, but sometimes they only have a gluten intolerance, or we find they have a gliadin intolerance. And but now if they have clinical symptoms and a specialist says that is due to gluten or gliadin, then they often get the support as well. But it's very difficult, and they don't all get it. And many ME patients, for many ME patients, it's good not to eat gluten containing food, but they wouldn't get any support.
No.
So it's only in special cases where you can see you get reactions, you can kind of document reactions on that, then you could get it. But what we find is sometimes we find celiac which hasn't been discovered in patients. Or we had one patient who came and also had a lot of other things and wanted an ME diagnosis, and she had celiac, and she said, I followed the diet, and she had high values. We said, you really, I do it when I get symptoms, you know, and yeah. So we find a lot of other things too.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's right. Sarah Myhill, who spoke at one of our conferences, her big beef is thyroid gets missed again and again and again, and she often gives thyroid to people who fall within the biochemical range. In the bottom 25%, she will treat with giving extra thyroid, and often people find that helpful. But if the thyroid is more complicated than just putting more T4 in, if you want T3, then that becomes more difficult. And things like selenium deficiency are not even considered. So we have all these issues emerging.
Selenium we don't measure. But
selenium is extremely low in England. Largely because we've stopped importing the Canadian wheat, which has got high selenium levels, but they threaten to grow GM wheat, so that's not helping. So, I mean, it's a big interweaving net, not just of medicine, but of science and also of agriculture and water supplies, as the geodiasis story will tell us in Norway again, that there's issues there which are important. And they're all interlinked, and someone somewhere has to try and hold the ring, which is and if they're not listened to, then of course the ring falls apart, and you get. But it's very interesting to hear what you have to say. What do you see in terms of the development of effective treatments, as opposed to just?
If we find if there are developed effective treatments, and we find kind of evidence for that they are working, or that you find kind of, I think when you get your kids more pointed and we can test people and then we can treat them. But the problem now has been that many patients in Norway have been trying kind of multi-antibiotic treatment, which has been, we can't support that because it's doses which aren't tested. It's it's so many problems in it. So we can't go into that until we have better results. But I think the research you're doing is very very important and interesting. And as soon as we get any good results, then we can try to do anything. And we could if we have a good reason to give a certain medicine, then we can start a trial on it. So we are looking at all that, but at this stage we can't kind of give any medicines to treat ME patients. I know we have a pediatrician who tries beta blockade on some in a very low dose on some of the children because of the orthostatic problems and the high pulse and the kind of stress with not being able to calm down. But what I've heard is that some get better and some get worse. So it's nothing where we see kind of any consistency yet. And I think also that might be due to groups, to different groups. But we are very interested in this, and we are very interested in the genetic research that's done, because maybe we find that some people have ME after this or that infection, and there's something we could treat, and other people have it for other reasons. So then you can go more specific. But by now we can't offer anything but a coping course. But what happens on the coping course is that ME patients, as you said, they see, oh, it's not only me, it's not that peculiar, because they think they have so strange symptoms. They think am I going crazy? It's kind of, you haven't heard of anything like that. And when they see other patients having the same experience, they feel a little bit more normal, and that helps a bit. And they also see, we also have always have patients who have been more ill from ME and being at the course with the patients, kind of, how would you call it? Well, anyway, they see somebody gets better.
Right.
And that's also very good to see. It's not only getting down, it's possible to get better. And I've heard from many of those patients that when I finally started to realize that when I drive myself too hard every day, I'm getting worse, then I was able to stop, and then it stabilized. And after that, I could get a little bit better, slowly. But as long as I think I just have to push myself, I just have to try, and today I have a good day, then I have to do all the things I didn't do when I was lying in the bed. And then they crash again, And as as soon as I really know that's right to stop, it's not wrong, it's not being lazy to stop when I've done something on a good day, then they can stabilize the disease, and I think that's very helpful, because even if I've had patients in my general practice and been telling them you mustn't use too much energy when you have a good day, because then you're getting worse. And then they go to the coping course, and afterwards they tell me, I didn't understand that wasn't only now, but that would drive me down all the more and more. So it needs really to be repeated. And what we also see at that course is that people feel an enormous guilt for not doing housework, for not doing work where they can earn money, and when they feel a little bit better and can go out and have a cup of coffee with a friend, they think, maybe I should be working, and I think these groups are very helpful for them to see where to put in their priorities, and that you have to function in everyday life before you can kind of function in working life, and so on. So I think it is a good, yeah.
Do patients who are actually in this stage of having to stop being highly active, do they get support from the state in terms of benefits to
No,
make?
they do.
They do, right.
But it's still a big struggle for many patients, because many patients feel their GP don't trust them. They rest for 3 days, and then they have a lot of makeup on and look very nice, and are very talking a lot and so on to explain everything. And the GP says, "You look perfectly well." Yeah. The GP doesn't see them the day after, and they don't go there the day after. So when I talk to GPs about that, I say, "Well, you don't see them the next day." Yeah. And I try to tell the patient, okay, next time, don't rest before you go to your doctor. Yeah. Show your doctor how you are when you're not rested and so on. But it's, they always want to perform, look the best, kind of, and it's not a good idea when you want to be trusted by your GP. Yeah. So some patients have problems there. Other patients have problems with the national insurance system. Yes, right. Because you get kind of sick leave money for 1 year, and then you have to apply for other type of money which is less. And sometimes I really struggle to get that, because then the authorities want specialist diagnosis and so on and so on. And but it's very different from one place to another place. Right. So but it's getting better, and they have understood that they can't push. I had some ME patients who, when they have been sick for a while, then they have to go work training to see if they have any work ability left. Mm-hmm. And then they try really hard, and they say, okay, maybe I can make 50% work, and then they try that, and after that they are 100% disabled, So, and I've been trying to tell the authorities that I have had some lectures for some doctors working with it in the authorities giving money to people and so on. And now it's allowed for ME patients to get disability money before doing work training or work testing, if the doctors say that they are not good enough for that. And I also try to tell the GPs, you must say to the authorities, when you apply for money, they mustn't try work training before they're stabilized and on their way up. And then if they have been stable on their way up, then they can try, but they should try in very small percentages. And that's working better and better. So, but it's not many years ago, but we had to go through that work thing, but they got much worse, and then they got their disability.
So that's real progress.
It's real progress on that. Yeah, it is.
We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say at the conference, and to picking up some of the things that you're getting from Judy and Dan and people like Jonathan Kerr as well. The big issue is a lot of this is expensive. I mean, you can't just roll out these expensive tests and expect people to have them done, as it were, on demand. On the other hand, it's got to be done somewhere with a sufficiently large number of people for the validity of the test to be established. But once that's established, then it should be incorporated into... You can then start miniaturising these tests in a most remarkable way. What starts out with a thing that needs 3 weeks to work up can be reduced to a dipstick, or a blood spot or something like that, which is what we really need to get for that.
We work on that as we go along.
Yeah.
So every test gets to where we can do it in the diagnostic arena. So we work on that. That's part of the plan. We don't have time to wait. And so what we hope to get here was that we could get agreement on how to hold samples so that they work, or how to make sample, and just do the sampling at various sites, and then ship them to us and let us do it. We need some resources for that, but instead of setting up a lab, we already spent $1 million on the lab. Why do you want to do that?
Well, that's encouraging.
And people that know exactly what they're doing, and you get the same thing done all the time.
One of the big beefs in the UK is that we've lost the flexibility and the breadth of testing in microbiology labs. So if you want an antiviral test, they'll do titers. Well, as John Cheer will tell us, often you can't get titers to reflect what's the actual viral state. But there are other tests that will do it, but those tests are not available, so you're stuffed. The poor old patient is then, and the doctor as well, is saying, well, if I can't get this information, then how can I make a judgment about the causality in this case, and potential treatment? Well, that was very good. 3 very nice ladies to tell us 3 very interesting stories. Thank you very much, and we enjoy the day tomorrow, and we'll enjoy Hillary tonight.